Charles, many thanks for your kind words, and many thanks to the IIF for its objective analysis and its support in what has been a very, very difficult period, as I'm sure all of you in this room realize. I will not try to compete with Joe Ackerman's speech. I will try to tell you a story. It's the story of a country that found itself in what was an impossible circumstances, decided to take a grip, and is well on its way, if not to solve its problems, but certainly to go on a sustainable path in order to solve them eventually. Like all good stories, like all tales, it should hopefully have a happy end, but we're still writing it. So even though we're more optimistic than we were a few months ago, we're not out of the woods. And again, like all good tales, it should have some broader lessons about how the Eurozone operates, lessons about how the international community operates. The story starts a year ago, as Charles de Lara mentioned, when a new government took power in Greece with a landslide majority, a 10-point difference in the polls from its opposition, and found itself facing three immediate and pressing challenges. The first one and most obvious was a fiscal mess. A deficit which in the 2009 budget was supposed to be 3% and ended up being almost 5 times that. A debt to GDP ratio above 100% on an upward path, clearly not sustainable. Next to this fiscal situation, deeper structural problems that had been put under the carpet for a very long time. Broken institutions, a political system that was not working, a public administration working on patronage, competitiveness problems, an erosion of competitiveness, which in a common currency area, without the ability to use your exchange rate, was clearly not sustainable. And thirdly, and perhaps most damaging of all, a huge credibility deficit. We had come to a point where nobody believed our numbers, nobody believed our policies, nobody believed our willingness to do something about this. This is where we were when we started. And we started what ended up being a race against time. From the very beginning, we started taking measures. We introduced a budget back a year ago, aimed to cut the deficit significantly. We then upped the ante with 2 more sets of measures to keep convincing the markets that we were serious about fiscal consolidation. We started introducing structural reforms, but this was a race against time and against financial markets that were quickly closing in on us, and against a debate in the EU about what to do with a country in the Eurozone that is clearly in an unsustainable position, and how to help it get out of that position, and in doing so, conserve the unity and the very stability of the unique currency area. The seminal moment was in May, 5 months ago, when the European Union, together with the IMF, came to an agreement to help Greece with a 110 billion euro facility in exchange for a 3-year program with strict conditionality criteria. That 110 billion has a number of firsts. For the IMF, it's a first to lend to any country over 30 times its quota. It's never been done before. For the European Union countries, for the Eurozone countries, it's an institutional first. There was never such a coordinated response to any problems in any particular country. And soon that one program for Greece was accompanied by a broader program, the European Financial Facility Fund, for other European countries, because the Eurozone realized that what was in the outset a Greek crisis was very quickly becoming a systemic crisis for the entire area. This program that was attached to the loan had 3 different pillars: a fiscal pillar, a structural pillar, and a pillar dealing with the financial stability, the stability of the banking system. Perhaps the central core, of course, was the fiscal consolidation aspect. An unprecedented 11-point correction in the deficit to bring it below 3%, the Maastricht Treaty threshold, by the end of 2013. Never been done before in the EU. And half of that in the first year, a front-loaded program in the first year. This is the kind of program that would allow the debt to GDP ratio to start declining and be manageable after 2013. Next to it, and perhaps the most important part of the program, a series of structural reforms to open up markets, remove rigidities, and make the Greek economy more competitive and more viable. And finally, a third component aimed at safeguarding the stability of the Greek banking system. A small parenthesis here. The Greek banking system has never been at the root of the Greek problems. It has been facing the outcome of the difficulties in the sovereign. And it has been facing, and is continuing to be facing, closed international financial markets. But therefore it was important in this particular conjuncture to help it retain liquidity, but also ultimately solvency, through the creation of a 10 billion financial facility and through the continuation of the extension of government guarantees and the work of the ECB in terms of providing liquidity, which was obviously extremely important in this particular juncture. Where are we 5 months since these first decisions? Well, perhaps what in the current environment has been most important is the progress made on the fiscal front. We're well on our way to do what many considered unachievable, which is to reach an 8% deficit, starting from roughly 14% at the end of last year. This unprecedented reduction is based on some very hard decisions that we took early on. 15% reduction in public sector wages, 10% reduction in pensions in the public and private sector, a 4 percentage point increase in VAT, 30% up in excise taxes, slashing operating expenditures throughout the public sector. Some very difficult decisions that were taken immediately, that were implemented, and are now beginning to bear fruit. It's a fiscal correction which is based primarily, as it should be, on cutting expenditures, and to a lesser extent, on higher revenues. And this is why, despite the fact that we have some lag in revenues compared to target, we're well on our way to achieve that target at the end of this year. Therefore, the first critical element of this program, which is monitored every quarter by visits from the so-called Troika, is well on its way to be achieved. We have submitted a pre-budget for 2011 where we intend to beat the 7.6% target for the deficit and get to a lower 7% deficit for next year. And at the same time, we have put together a number of structural fiscal reforms to make sure that these kind of cuts and increase in revenues are sustainable over the medium term. Tax reform, which has broadened the tax base, cracked down on tax evasion, and therefore diminishes the difference between revenues as a percentage of GDP between Greece and the EU, which stands at about 5 to 6 percentage points, and the Fiscal Management and Responsibility Bill, which puts our budget framework, design, execution, at par with the best in Europe and the world, introduces expenditure caps, standard contingency margins, and procedures that make sure that the kind of excesses that we've seen in the past will not be repeated. The second pillar of the program has been the structural reforms. And there, we're not only on track, but we're actually ahead of schedule. Perhaps the centerpiece there has been pension reform. In one fell swoop, we introduced the most radical, comprehensive pension reform that any European country has done in recent history, bringing retirement age to 65, eliminating early retirement, making pensions, calculating pensions on full lifetime earnings, merging pension funds into 3, and capping what was to be a completely unsustainable doubling of pension expenditures as a percentage of GDP from 12 to 24% by 2050. We capped it to 2.5 above where it is today with a horizon of 2050, thus bringing it in line with the rest of the EU. And also, in doing so, introduced a standard correction mechanism so that every 3 years we look again based on actuarial studies and further correct the system as we go along. Labour market reform to bring more flexibility to what was one of the most rigid labour markets in Europe. Opening up closed professions, starting with the trucking profession, where we showed that we will not back down and we will not stand back when a particular social group tries to take the economy and society hostage. We ended up having to mobilize the truckers and push this through Parliament on our majority. Following that are the other closed professions. We've submitted a bill to Parliament to restructure the state-owned railway, which loses 1 billion a year and has an accumulated debt of over 10 billion. And following that are the rest of the public sector enterprises. And we have laid out a vast privatization program which spans ports, airports, water, energy, gaming, real estate, and has a flexible approach from concessions to outright sales to minority stakes, and is aimed to revitalize sectors that for a long time have been working well below potential. So the structural aspect of the program is well advanced. The financial pillar is punctuated by some recent moves by Greek banks, which show that we do have a banking system that is coming out of its worst period and is looking ahead in a more confident manner. We have a capital share increase by the biggest Greek bank of over $4 billion. A lot of discussions between other banks that will help them make strategic moves and thus make them more comfortable in the new environment. And finally, after many months of a steady erosion of the deposit base, we are seeing in September a reversal of the trend and a net inflow, which is a very positive sign. Where do we go from here? Well, it's fair to say that being in this town 4 months ago and being in this town now, there's a sea of difference. The attitudes have changed from the totally negative and dismissive to the cautiously positive and expecting to see what the next moves are. The kind of concerns that I keep hearing are the following. There are specific concerns. For example, what are you doing about your revenues? Will you be able to crack down on tax evasion? Well, we have recently passed a bill to change the way that the justice system treats taxation, tax disputes, because it takes 7 to 10 years for a tax dispute to be settled in court. And we have 150,000 pending cases and over 30 billion in courts. We've reversed the burden of proof in tax cases, shortened down procedures, and made it clear that courts can no longer continue to give tax offenders a very low probability of ever paying. And we are seeing the first results of this. Our August VAT figures are up 10%. Our September figures are 17% up. So even though we're not there yet, we can beginning to see what in effect are measures that were only enacted in the middle of 2010 and therefore will only now begin to bear fruit. The second concern that I keep hearing is, well, is this sustainable? Politically, socially, is what you're doing sustainable? It is interesting to note that despite the image of the burning trash can on CNN, if you compare Europe with Greece, if you compare Greece with any other major European country, and if you count the days lost in strikes, if you count the percentage of the population out on the streets against a major reform such as pensions, you will see that there's a big difference between the image and the reality. Of course, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of protests, but you have a strong government which is elected in the first year of its first term, and which is managing to push through reforms without losing popular support. For a very simple reason. There is a very clear understanding in Greek society of the changes that needed to be done. And as long as we keep convincing that something will come out of the changes, and that we're trying to cushion the blow for those most vulnerable, because we're making tremendous efforts for that, we will continue to keep that delicate balance and continue to be able to push reforms. But perhaps the two main questions that I keep hearing have to do with debt sustainability and growth. The question is, will you be able to keep servicing your debt after the end of this program? The answer is yes, because we will have significant primary surpluses and growth rates that will allow us to do so. This is why the argument about debt restructuring is beside the point. Debt restructuring is not going to happen in Greece for good economic and political reasons, both for Greece and for the Eurozone. For Greece, because it would impose a tremendous burden on citizens and on banks, and for the Eurozone, because it would create a flight to safety effect, which would destroy the whole area. And in that context, I think the recent IMF paper on why this will not happen is a very interesting read. The fourth question is growth. At the end of the day, this whole story is sustainable only if Greece returns to higher growth rates, if it generates investment, growth, jobs. Do remember that in a good part of the last decade, Greece was one of the fastest growing European countries. For a couple of years, we were growing faster than Ireland, and we were growing and closing the gap in per capita income with the rest of the Eurozone. We're now in a situation where this year GDP is going to drop by 4 percentage points, -3 in the first semester, roughly -4 at the end of the year. That will be the bottom of our recession. Next year we're estimating -2.6, -2.7, and the return to positive growth rates from 2012 onwards. Why are we optimistic? Well, because if you look at the rigidities of the economy, you can well look at them and say, well, a country that has so many rigidities cannot grow. But why don't we turn this on its head? A country that is doing something about all these rigidities has a tremendous growth potential that is waiting to be unleashed. We have, on all OECD rankings, the worst product market regulation, the most restrictive labor market regulation, closed professions. Once you start doing something about all these things, as we're already demonstrating, that increases your growth potential. And it is interesting to see that there is a lot of investment interest already in place. Interest from China that are using Piraeus as a transport and logistics center for their operations in Europe. Interest for Qatar in real estate. Interest in Abu Dhabi in shipyards. Interest in clean energy, in high tech. Interest in a number of infrastructure projects through our privatization program. This interest is there, it's building up, and it's real. And this makes us believe that we have closed a particular growth story, growth paradigm, and we're opening a new one. Let me conclude by drawing some broader lessons, which I think are applicable not just to Greece, but also more broadly. They're very simple. You might even think simplistic. My first lesson is things tend to catch up with you. If you leave them and ignore them for a very long time, they have this nasty habit of catching up with you. This is what happened with our fiscal situation. This is what happened with lack of building institutions. But this is also what happened for the EU as a whole, where we have a common currency area that was built painstakingly, but where we knew from the very beginning that there were pieces missing. And eventually, we had to face the fact that an asymmetric shock in one country, without all the transfer mechanisms that exist in common currency areas, would lead to trouble. And here we are. The second point is that time is of the essence and delays cost. I think we saw that quite clearly in the time building up to the May decisions. The Eurozone is a complicated beast with different animals, different institutional histories, political calendars, and you can argue that it took its time to decide, but you can also argue that at the end it rallied and it was there. And anyone who underestimates the willingness and capacity of the Eurozone to defend its own and this political and economic project, as long as countries do what they should be doing, I think will be proven wrong in the future. Having said that, Delays are costly. And looking forward, we should think of that in terms of preventing future crises. Finally, ad hoc solutions are fine. They put out the fire. But you need permanent solutions for problems that you know will recur. And this is why the discussion which has started in Europe, and in which the IMF, for example, is participating through the more global dialogue around these issues, about economic governance issues, financial reform issues, is critical to make sure that crises such as the one we've seen, that start in one particular country, but can very quickly become systemic and threaten the viability of the entire financial and economic system, will be contained and prevented. Let me finish with one phrase. I would be stating the obvious if I was saying to you that this has not been a honeymoon period for a Minister of Finance. I would also, however, not be doing justice to the work that has been done if I did not say that I can now stand here much more confidently than I could a few months ago. We came to the brink, and we managed to stop before falling over with the help of the international community and because we took some tough but necessary decisions. We will continue the same path. Not because the international community tells us to, but because this is what's best for Greek citizens. Thank you very much.